So it's been 1 month since House Democrats opened an impeachment inquiry into President Trump, and it was another busy week in the investigation. On Tuesday, top U.S. envoy to Ukraine, Bill Taylor, delivered what Democrats called a damning testimony. Taylor contradicted the White House, essentially saying there was a quid pro quo during President Trump's calls with Ukraine. Meanwhile, Republicans in the House and Senate heeded the president's call to get tougher in their response to the impeachment inquiry. They did so through resolutions condemning the process and protests that delayed one Defense Department official's appearance for 5 hours. To recap the big developments from this past week, I want to bring in Major Garrett and Ed O'Keefe. Major is CBS News chief Washington correspondent. Ed is a CBS News political correspondent. Democrats say that acting ambassador to Ukraine William Taylor's testimony amounted to a sea change. House Republicans, however, don't seem as convinced. So, Major, what impact do you think Taylor's testimony had?
Well, within the Democratic caucus, it was a galvanizing moment. They believe, that is to say, House Democrats who either witnessed the deposition itself or heard about it through press accounts or in conversations with Democrats who were there, William Taylor drew, from their point of view, a direct line, an unequivocal line between the president's demand for investigations either of 2016 conspiracy theories about Ukraine and election meddling, or Burisma, Hunter Biden, etc., and future military aid, and also a direct line between that suspended and held back military aid and an announcement by the new Ukrainian government that it would investigate one or both of those, and only that announcement of that pending investigation would either free up the military aid or guarantee President Zelensky, newly elected, a meeting here in Washington with President Trump, which he very much wanted. Now, that is a Democratic interpretation of the testimony from William Taylor, who, we should point out, was brought back into the role of chargé d'affaires, or ambassador to Ukraine, after the Trump administration dumped its previous ambassador to Ukraine, and he was called back into service out of retirement by none other than the current Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. Why does that matter? Well, some of the Republican criticism, starting with President Trump, that William Taylor is a never-Trumper or somehow part of a deep state or an anti-Trump bureaucracy within the State Department. Well, that intervention to bring him back into government by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, never accused of being a never-Trumper, according to my recollection, would undercut that.
Okay. On Monday, we heard the president issue this call to Republicans. Let's listen in.
The Republicans have to get tougher and fight. We have some that are great fighters, but they have to get tougher and fight because the Democrats are trying to hurt the Republican Party for the election.
And then 2 days later, Republicans protested the closed-door deposition of a top Pentagon official. They argue they want more transparency in the process. So, Ed, this question's for you. If this testimony is as damning as Democrats say it is, why are Republicans so eager to have these hearings in public?
That's a good question. I think part of what we saw this week with this demonstration here just outside what we call the SCIF, or the secure conference room where these intelligence matters are discussed, was designed to appease the president and heed his call to at least appear to be taking on a more aggressive stance against what the Democrats are up to. They're frustrated because if you look at the last two impeachments, of impeachment processes at least, of Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton, there was far more bipartisan cooperation. But there was also closed-door testimony compiled before public hearings. And some pointed out this week, during those Benghazi hearings a few years ago when House Republicans were investigating what the Obama administration knew about what happened in Libya, it all began with closed-door testimony in the exact same set of conference rooms. And Democrats at the time, essentially the shoe was on the other foot. Democrats were complaining that it was all being done behind closed doors. Republicans said it had to be. What happens once this testimony becomes public remains to be seen. And you're right that it could potentially make things worse for the president and Republicans. And it's why it's been telling, especially in the last 10 days, that Republicans have not necessarily criticized the content delivered by these witnesses that has been leaked out from the closed-door sessions, but it's the process that they've been criticizing as too secret, too Byzantine. we'll wait and see when exactly hearings will be held and how the argument potentially changes.
Exactly. And Major, ever since this process, this inquiry began, there have been questions about how the White House would respond. So here's what Senator Lindsey Graham said he'd like to see the president do, followed by the president's remarks today. Take a listen.
I know this sounds weird, but Clinton, look what he did. What he did is he had a team that was organized, had legal minds that could understand what was being said versus the legal proceedings in question, and they were on message every day.
I don't have teams. Everyone's talking about teams. I'm the team. I did nothing wrong.
So, Major, you covered the Clinton impeachment.
Sure.
Explain what Senator Graham means and why the president doesn't seem to want to follow his advice.
Well, there's a long, long answer. You could write books, and books have been written about this. I won't go into every aspect of it.
I want the full history, please.
But in essence, what Lindsey Graham is referring to is every step of the independent counsel process, led by Ken Starr, to the degree that they could, Clinton lawyers fought on behalf of their client, President Clinton. Didn't fight ultimately successfully, and in fact, the Starr report became the essentially evidentiary basis of articles of impeachment against Bill Clinton. But even in that process, Clinton attorneys negotiated aggressively on behalf of their client, the president, and the presidency itself. There were negotiated settlements about cross-examination, access to witness testimony, evidence, and the like. What Lindsey Graham is observing is there doesn't appear to be any concerted effort within the White House to do any of that work, just to say, no, we're not going to cooperate. Lindsey Graham and many other Republicans I've talked to, I'm sure Ed has talked to some as well, probably more than I have, are afraid that that objectionist strategy legally, we're not going to cooperate with anything, this is illegitimate and unconstitutional, is an indefensible posture for the White House to take and will ultimately, if challenged in court, fail. And if that strategy fails, there is no backup. There is no place to go to retreat from, no cooperation. And so it is Lindsey Graham's informed opinion, recognizing what happened in the Clinton impeachment, that you need to have not only a team, you need to have a legal strategy and a communication strategy about what you're fighting for and on what basis. And to the question you asked Ed a moment ago, why do Republicans want this testimony in public? There is a sense among Republicans that Democrats are over-describing this, believing, as Republicans would assert, Democrats always have the absolute worst about President Trump, and that a public airing of this will be far less precise and exact, as Democrats have described it publicly. Republicans believe essentially Democrats are over-describing what these depositions reveal, and under cross-examination and some other questions, it's not as clear as that they're trying to let the public believe. That's the Republican hope. It has not yet been realized, but that's why they're pressing for a public accounting and more transparency in this process, because ultimately they believe they can use the long-standing accusation against Democrats. You've always been opposed to President Trump. You've always looked for a reason to impeach him, and you're over-describing, over-characterizing that which the evidence underlying it that leads the public to fairly believe.
Yeah, the Republican hope is to have people make judgments for themselves. Yes, Ed?
Well, and actually, maybe this is more for Major. I mean, isn't part of the issue here in terms of the president's inability to build a team around him that, in terms maybe we can all appreciate and our TV junkie president can appreciate, is that he'd have to cede some of the airtime and essentially have a co-host or an on-air buddy helping make this argument for him on the news every night?
It certainly would make things less confusing for us. We wouldn't have someone like Mick Mulvaney give a press conference and then have the president say what he said was wrong and then have him put out a new statement saying, oh, the president was correct. I mean...
Right. So that's an excellent point, Laura. It's a really, really good point. And it seems like 700 years ago, it was just last week that Mick Mulvaney went out to the briefing room and stumbled into this process where he said, essentially, get over it. There's politics in foreign aid, and yes, things were suspended or held back, that is to say military aid to Ukraine, because the president raised the question of the DNC server in 2016. He essentially put those things together in his own words. He tried to back away from that, but unsuccessfully in large part. So for Republicans who are saying, boy, we wish you had a concerted strategy, they don't want people to run to the briefing room willy-nilly, unprepared. If they're not going to have a strategy, they would be content with, just leave it to the president, because we're not confident that the rest of you can handle this. But if you're going to put a team together, put a team together and have regular meetings almost hour by hour, as the Clinton White House did. War Room was not an exaggeration. They fought this as a pitched battle politically and legally and from a communication strategy every minute of every day. I lived through it. It was exhausting then. It's exhausting now, but there at least was a method to the Clinton approach, which was, this is a battle on all fronts, and you've got to understand the legalisms, you've got to understand the politics, and you've got to understand a way to communicate about both the politics and the law. And they put together a team to do that. To Ed's point, the president doesn't like to share the stage, believes he stirs it better than anyone else. There's ample proof to suggest he's right about that. And he also simply doesn't believe in the art of delegation, especially when his political fate is concerned. He's in charge of his political fate. And as he would argue, if he were sitting right here, I've done pretty well at that, haven't I?
Ed, let's end with you with a question regarding this point in the inquiry, and we're really just at the beginning, but is there any good way to gauge Republican support for the president in the Senate?
Right. Not necessarily, unless you look at this resolution that Lindsey Graham is pushing for. Today he's announcing that he's got 50 of the 53 Republican senators on board. And this is essentially a resolution that calls on the House Democrats to do what House Republicans have been saying. Hold public hearings, get this process out into the open, and make it fair both to the president and to the general public. For example, Lamar Alexander, a more mainstream, long-serving giant of the Senate, explaining his support for this afternoon, saying in part, House Democrats might want to stop and take a look at how House Democratic majority bent over backwards to include Republicans and the president's representatives in the 1974 Nixon impeachment and compare that with the one-sided, largely secret inquiry they are conducting today. So again, Republicans for now focused on the process, not necessarily on the content. As for who might be a potential swing vote in the jury of the Senate, certainly Mitt Romney has been outspoken in his concerns. Susan Collins has said she will reserve judgment, both publicly and privately among her colleagues, until or if a trial is held. There's a belief that maybe a handful of others, depending on how things go, could be gettable, but nobody believes that the process is anywhere near getting the 60-plus votes that you would need among senators to impeach him.
Just a quick word on that, Laura. What is important to also point out about what Lindsey Graham, the senator from South Carolina, tried to accomplish earlier this week, but was unable to. The first resolution, or the first letter he wanted to have Senate Republicans sign on to, it said, we're going to vote not to convict. And Senate Republicans told him, we're not there. So if you want to make a process argument, we'll join you on a process argument, because there are precedents that we believe should be observed for not only the sake of this moment, but for all historical impeachments in the future should they come. But that's not what Lindsey Graham originally wanted to do. He wanted to get the vast majority of Senate Republicans to say publicly, we're not going to convict this president. And they would not do that. They're holding their options open, to say they're keeping an open mind and don't want to prejudge the facts. That in itself is politically telling, because I think Ed and I would agree on this. You asked that question a month ago, 8 weeks ago, Republicans in the Senate would have been much more likely to say, we're not going to convict. There's no case here. They're not so sure anymore.
So maybe it is evidence that these hearings are beginning to start to sway members of the Senate and
at least to reserve judgment. At least to reserve judgment. Absolutely.
Major Garrett and Ed O'Keefe, thank you so much for your analysis.
Sure.